Good morning, John Cottrell. How are you?
I'm doing well, Jerry Bowie, and how are you?
Hi. Welcome to the Mindfully Gay podcast.
Hello.
And we're glad to have you here with us, listening. And as always, we want to invite you to participate with your comments or your communications with us, which you can do on any of our social media platforms on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, because we want to hear.
Yes, we want to hear from you. And let me add this. If you are listening to this on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, leave us a review.
Yes, I was thinking about that.
Yes, leave us a review because, when you leave a review, it actually reaches more listeners. And we would love to have more people just engage in the conversation. So that just means more listeners. And so your help of giving us a quick review would be quite great. Thanks.
And we know you're listening because I'll go somewhere.
Yeah.
And people are like, "Oh, you're Jerry Bowie. Oh, I listen to your podcast." I hear that all the time. And I'm like, right now I've counted 3 listeners.
I know I've counted 3 as well. And don't you feel like a celebrity? Oh, I listened to your show. Oh, thanks.
Is that the OnlyFans page? Or
So what is our topic today, Jerry?
Well, you came up with it. I know part of it is why do women listeners love us so much?
Yeah, look forward to that episode because there is an interesting phenomenon. We can just a little sidetrack here before we get into our topic of who is listening. It's talking about our listeners. Who is listening? Certainly, our target audience is queer men or folks who identify as queer, whether it's bisexual men, gay men, trans men. And hopefully our conversations on the podcast have been, catered, to you and relevant to you. And we believe it is. And we seem to have sparked interest among a wider group.
I have to do a shout out to my friend Deborah, who lives in Colorado. I'm convinced that Deborah was probably a gay person in a prior life.
Maybe that's it.
Probably a revolutionary, or she's burned at the cross or something. But I believe that she's a kindred soul. So
yes, well, thanks to all of our listeners, no matter how you identify.
All right. So what is the topic today, John?
Shame. Shame.
Whenever that word comes up,
yeah.
The first image that comes to mind is in Game of Thrones.
I was thinking the same thing.
That woman with the bell, shame.
That's what I just thought of too. Exactly thought of that.
I'm like, she reminds me of my bishop.
Oh my God. I mean, if you know that image, and just thinking of that image, since we just thought of that, would you say that that's a true depiction of what maybe queer men experience as a form of shame?
In Utah, because there is the religious overlords. I don't know that it's coming at us in that way, but I think we internalize it that way.
Yeah.
Ever since I saw that episode, whenever I have a moment of shame, I see her. And like you're my mother.
Right.
But yeah, so shame is such a big topic. And I like to play this game. I've done it before on the podcast. If we weren't using the word shame, what would be another word that captures the concept? Yeah.
That's a tough one. Because, shame really just sits kind of in its own little space.
Right, but it has so many complexities to it.
Right.
The closest I come up to is guilt, because we frequently use the term guilt and shame.
Yeah.
Right? But I don't know if I can think of a word that is in relationship to shame.
No.
That's not shame.
No. So what would you say, how would you define shame, or what is shame for you, or how have you experienced shame?
Is this a series?
Yeah.
Well, look, I think shame to me, I'm just going off the top of my head so we can refine this, but
Yeah.
I think of shame as an emotional response to something that's not congruent or consistent with an ideal, right? So I just came back from the gym. I was telling you about this workout. And I know there have been times where I feel like I can't like get it right. And I'll try and I'll try. And sometimes that sense of failure turns into this space of disappointment. And then the negative self-talk kicks in that, you know, kind of eats away at my sense of possibility because I'm stuck in the place of feeling like a failure or inadequate in some way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I think I could describe that as a moment of shame, but I guess I can also quickly count it as a cognitive distortion too. Like I don't think that's an accurate way of internalizing it.
Right. And you really hit on some words I think that kind of fit into the maybe definition in the category, that big category of shame. You mentioned disappointment, feeling like a failure, um, um, having done something wrong or made a mistake,
Mm-hmm.
and then and when that thought, because it shows up in so many forms or so many things could possibly trigger it, um, that it quickly or can quickly get internalized as, something's wrong with me, or I'm not good enough. Those are the feelings and thoughts and words that really come up for me about shame. Like, oh, I did something wrong. I'm a mistake. I'm a failure, and get embarrassed. And my body wants to kind of cower and hide away. I mean, that's kind of beginnings of my images and thoughts of what shame is. And I can align with that as far as what shame is for me when I feel like I'm not good enough.
Yeah.
But it's just a cognitive distortion, as you said. It's my own belief. It might not be true in the real world, in the real sense, but somehow my mind has warped this interaction or event or something into something where, ooh, I'm not doing this right, or I'm wrong, or I'm a failure. I can't do this. I'm a disappointment.
Mm-hmm. So maybe because we just, I know this podcast is coming out later, but we just barely released today is January 10th. So 7 days ago, we released the sex podcast. There's a podcast about sex. Look it up. And it's really juicy too.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of times I was listening to that. A couple of times we're like, I need a cigarette. I need a rest. It's hot in here.
Where's my fan? Yeah.
But because I'm thinking about how shame tends to intersect. And I'm just making observations as a therapist who's worked with a lot of gay men, a lot of people in general, right? The baggage of shame that we carry in reference to our bodies, and that we carried around our sexuality, right? And look, I remember like in the late 80s and 90s and maybe even early 2000s, I think about ways that gay men were describing themselves in ads and apps to, right, straight acting.
Yeah.
Or at that time, everyone was a top. There was like serious clout in being a top, right? And it was almost like admitting to being a bottom there was some kind of layer of shame to that.
Yeah.
When we don't put our faces and attach them, right? I can't help but to wonder what layers. We all have our stories, but I just wonder how does shame play into those parts of our identities around our sexuality and even our bodies?
Yeah. I mean, for me, and I've shared this before on earlier episodes, but, realizing that I was different, when I was quite young, I felt different. I couldn't label it, couldn't name it. I just knew something was a little bit different about me. And as I was getting older, and finding that I was attracted to other boys, and it made me kind of wonder and think, and because of my Catholic upbringing, knowing from that um, context that homosexuality is sinful, it is wrong. And so, even though I didn't label myself as a homosexual, I didn't see myself like that, but because of my feelings, I was quite nervous. It made me scared because, well, if I am that way, how is then my church going to treat me? And if my parents found out, um, what would that mean? And so the conjuring of
Mm,
ideas just start flooding my little brain. Am I going to be ostracized? Am I going to be kicked out of the house? Are they going my basically it was are my parents going to love me anymore?
mm,
That's basically bottom line. It's like, am I going to be loved anymore
right.
and taken care of? And will I have to just be by myself? So there was a lot of fear around that. And I think maybe that's another word that kind of
Comes with
fits.
shame.
Yeah, comes with shame, just that fear. And even getting older, just fear of presenting myself in an authentic way. Just like, on the ads and stuff, straight acting, top, because that appears to be, I'm using air quotes, more masculine, more like a man, right? And that's okay in society. But anything that seemed effeminate or you know identifying and saying that you're a bottom or anything like that, that's
Yeah.
death. Really ostracized right there, right off the bat. And so I know I was very mindful, careful, thoughtful about how I presented myself, like at school, even in grade school. Don't look at that boy too long. you know don't touch that boy in a certain way, because I'll get found out. Not that anyone cared or was even looking for anything like that within me. But again, my little brain
Yeah.
was just going, going, going. Like, there's something that's going to show that I'm gay or I like boys, and I'm going to get found out. And I guess the worst case scenario was I'm going to get kicked out. I'm not going to be taken care of. I'm not going to be loved or liked.
Mm,
And or I'm going to get hit and beat up. So, yeah, those were my fears as a kid, even,
yeah.
and just trying to be very careful in how I showed up in the world.
Well, as I'm listening to you, John, kind of what's coming to mind, right, is shame a byproduct of when we feel like we're not fitting into societal norms? If the societal norms are heteronormative, hypermasculine, right?
Yeah.
If it's like if I'm not doing what the church tells me to do, if I'm not doing what my parents think I should be doing,
Mm-hmm.
if right, that I immediately recognize the dissonance between what may be an authentic expression
Mm-hmm.
and what's being received.
Mm-hmm.
And then my fear is about how I'm received.
How am I received? Yeah.
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 I have a friend who just turned me on to, I know it's 2025 and I apologize, but I've just discovered Dan Savage's
Say it again.
Dan
Oh.
Savage podcast.
Oh, yes. Uh-huh.
What's the name of it?
I don't know the name of it, but I know Dan Savage.
Love. I think it's called Oh, sorry, Dan.
Oh,
Savage Lovecast.
okay.
And for the new year, he had Esther Perel on there.
Oh, really?
And for those who don't know who Esther Perel is, she's a psychotherapist who's from France. So she has like this really intense accent that just makes everything she says so valid.
Exactly. Just with the accent.
But her expertise is in relationship issues. And she's kind of like the Brene Brown of couples issues.
Mm-hmm.
But her and Dan were having this conversation about relationship dynamics. And she made this interesting observation. And I have seen this as a therapist. And maybe the reason I resonated with the podcast is because philosophically what she was talking about is what I believe. But she goes, when there's acts of infidelity within a relationship, we immediately default that the problem is the infidel, the person who created, right?
Yeah.
And she's like, it doesn't take in consideration the dynamics of the relationship that might have led that person to go outside the relationship.
Sure, right.
And it sets up this interesting power dynamic. And then she kind of explored different kind of sexual dynamics in relationships where you may have one partner who's hypersexual and one partner who is not very sexual at all. It's a very interesting podcast. I encourage people to listen to it. I think it's the first one they did in the new year. But what I appreciated about it is kind of the subtext of a lot of what she was talking about is how culture is kind of set up to shame these normative ideas, right? We create a sense of normality by consensus, not necessarily through analysis or individualization, right? So if you're gay, you're out. If you're straight, you're in. Yeah. And how that kind of even impacts our sense of what is or isn't appropriate in the sexual dynamics in our lives. And then the other piece I just was going to say is, even though we're talking specifically, right, to gay, bi, and trans men, this issue of sexuality and shame is across the board.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of religious subtext is sex is kind of a necessary evil only for the purposes of procreation. Right. And I mean, that's been a political justification in denying gay rights.
Exactly.
But isn't it interesting that we look at these ecstatic, erotic states of being that are often allow for full, authentic expression, and we're going to outlaw it? We're going to create a story of shame around it. How dare you? Right? And then the other part of shame is just not the lady with the bell, but what is it about us that's willing to take it on and internalize it?
Yeah.
Right? I make your opinion kind of my judge and jury. And if I don't have your acceptance, or if I don't experience that from you, right, I have a sense of shame.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes, I mean, there's other places we can go with this. For instance, how we promote and advertise gay existence is very much a youth-centric message right now. Although daddies are becoming popular. But that youth-centric message, when you don't see yourself represented through age, race, whatever identity markers are, when you don't see yourself represented, right? Sometimes the default is, oh, I wonder, I can't begin to tell you how many older gay men feel no longer relevant.
Right.
But they can't tell you exactly why they don't feel relevant. And my little mind goes, probably because you don't see yourself represented in your community or in the broader messages of the community. But in that lack of normality, if you will, people tend to internalize their value and worth and create some shame, because how many older men will say, well, just look at this body. It's not what it used to be. And now that's a story of shame, right? Yeah.
Right.
So I don't know. I'm just kind of riffing here because I think this is an interesting topic.
Yeah. It comes when I'm what's coming to mind right now is, just the stories we tell ourselves, right? And how we kind of walk in the world and see the world, and how we see the world and how we perceive to be seen, right? Um, and we create these little stories, narratives in our head, right? And what I imagine, just to try to create an image of what happens and what happens with internalizing such storylines, is kind of like a thought. See if you can picture this with me. This is maybe way off course, but picture this with me, because this is what came to mind. Something happens, like, you're called a name, or you feel like, you can't kick a ball, you kick like a girl. Okay, let's just use that as an example. And that kind of frazzles you as a kid. And so that's just a little blip, on the brain. And but that blip kind of starts to, like, ooze or bleed, and just kind of starts to pour over you. And if that type of message, you kick like a girl, you're a girl, or things like that, get reinforced, that blip gets a little larger, and that blob, let's say, just kind of melts all the way through your body.
Yeah.
So it becomes a part of you. That belief, well, I guess I kick like a girl.
Mm.
So that must be true.
Therefore, I can't do it.
Therefore I can't do it, at least in this context.
Yeah.
Because I'm being put down for it. That's the message it seems to be creating in this context. You kick like a girl equals you don't know how to kick the ball, right? And so that becomes your belief system. And that's just one tiny example. Think of all those kinds of references that you got as a kid, as a teenager, as an adult,
Mhm.
as we age. That ooze just keeps enveloping you. I guess that's true. Well, I guess that's true. Well, I guess that's true.
Mm.
And um, and maybe we can talk a little bit about this later, but I'm just thinking, as we have this power, I think, as gay people, to break free of that. We have a resiliency and a strength and a power and a gift because of who we are, to kind of break that mold. Let's say that ooze kind of covered you, and it covered you like a clay cloth or something, and we know how to break through it. And we've talked on this podcast how you can break through it. But kind of going back to internalizing, that's kind of the image I have.
Mm.
It just kind of takes over, and it becomes a part of you. And you just believe that's who I am.
Yeah.
That's what I am.
Well, I totally agree with you, John. And I've often said, I think the advantage to being gay, the blessing of being gay, right, is the deliberate self-examination that one engages, right? Coming out is not like, oh, I'm coming out today,
Yeah.
right? I think for our heterosexual counterparts, the world and the privileges of the world are designed to validate and support and sustain all aspects of their existence. And so if I recognize that that's not working for me, and I have to like be contemplative and considering, right, the story of who I am, and then right, that layer of self-examination is not something that's shared from a privileged society. I imagine anyone who's coming out of any kind of closet probably goes through that process.
Yeah.
I think if I were to find myself as part of a marginalized group of people, like here in Utah, where the predominant race is white, right? I may have to really strongly consider my ethnicity or my race and how it coexists in this kind of a population.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a significant gift.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking as you're talking, like the antidote, in my mind, the antidote to shame is embracing authenticity.
Yeah.
And I think about my first reference when it comes to that is Miguel Ruiz's The Four Agreements, which the template of that book is about authenticity. But I would say the whole book, but definitely in the first couple of chapters, right, is him provoking the consideration of how did you run into the conclusions of who you are?
Mm-hmm.
And is it your story or is it one that was handed to you?
Uh-huh.
And he makes a good observation that in many cases, even before we have formed language, we have some concept of how we fit into the world. And then we spend the rest of our lives deconstructing it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's always taking us back to, authenticity.
Yeah, authenticity. Just in going back to the image that I presented, it's finding again that nugget of authenticity. So what message, whether it comes from the outside or inside, yeah, because it might be an internal process. Because like you said, like coming out isn't just I'm going to come out today. It's a contemplative event. It takes time. You probably sit with yourself and think about the pros and cons of coming out and how am I going to be perceived, et cetera, et cetera. And so you're doing the same thing, I think, is presenting another seed of, I really want to be myself, and this is who I am, and I'm okay with that. And that becomes that new, essence that starts to maybe thread through your entire system. And that becomes your new belief system. And maybe there's some things that you can certainly shift with that along the way. But I think that's the power of authenticity and the power of making that shift, that antidote away from or passing through shame, removing that shell of whatever that was
Yeah.
that doesn't fit and doesn't work with who you really are, and that new story begins to blossom within you,
Right.
and that can prosper and grow until it's at a place where, you know what, now I can come out. Now it feels correct. This feels right. This
Right.
is who I am, and I can bust through that door.
There's some science that supports this.
Mm.
And is the word neuroplasticity?
Yeah, that's
Okay,
right.
yeah. Which is basically what you're saying is,
Mm-hmm.
right? Our brain is wired.
It's wired.
But the wiring is a byproduct of environment, information that we're feeding it, information that supports it.
Right.
And to shift the paradigm,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's kind of like a workout. When you first go to the gym, it's like, what the fuck am I doing, right?
Yeah.
But then after a week or two, it's a routine.
Mm-hmm.
And then a little bit longer, it becomes a habit,
Right.
right? And after a while, I just can't live without it.
Yeah.
I don't even really think about it.
It's your lifestyle.
Yeah.
It becomes lifestyle.
But what's happening to the brain,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you will, it's like the sedentary brain kind of atrophies and those connections go away.
Right.
And the new connections are created.
Exactly.
And so, part of what you're talking about, right? The blips,
Yeah.
right, is the old story, is the old programming, is the old neural pathways, the old neural pathways. And the willingness to take on new stories, the willingness to be working at a higher consciousness, to be deliberate about seeking desired outcomes in my life, right? That the more I tell people, self-esteem is not an event.
Right.
Right? It's a practice. It's a process.
Mm-hmm.
But the neuroplasticity of that supports it.
It supports it.
And so what feels like a lot of effort initially, but it's interesting how many people, of course, they do this every, right now the gym is packed.
Right now, yeah.
Because it's right after the new year. By the end of the month, we'll have our treadmills back. But the same thing with self. I often think this question, what is the difference between people? And I'm asking this question philosophically because I do not know the answer. But I think, what is the difference between people who stay so committed and gravitated to a story that holds them back, as opposed to people who are willing to embrace and expand and be on a continued growth trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is the difference? And I don't believe it's always about personal histories and traumas, because I know lots of people with personal histories and traumas who stay perpetually stuck. But I also know people who move beyond those stories and accomplish really very amazing things.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that, there's no one clear answer because there's so many examples of that, like you said, where um, people can have really challenging upbringings or circumstances in their lives, and that story is pretty heavy and it's ingrained into their system. And you would think, oh, they'll never change, but somehow they find a way through it, right? And then there's others who just don't, right? And so it is a very fascinating question. How I relate to that, because I'm just thinking of a personal example, like, well, how does that work in me? Because I'm a confident guy, and I do a lot of things, and I enjoy what I do, and I have a certain lifestyle that I've really enjoy, and I think it's supported who I am and what I am. But there's still this layer of 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 fear in me, and shame sometimes, and am I good enough? I mean, that's because it's old story stuff, and I think I've worked through most of that, but it sometimes it creeps back in,
Mhm.
and it can get me. And for me, it's like, well, why is it getting me? I think what happens for me, if I'm reminded of that old story, it's like, oh, there's that old story again, right? And then for some reason, it gets reinforced. And I just chuckled right there because, let's say you see a red Corvette, driving down the street. It's like, oh, wow, cool, a red Corvette. And then all of a sudden you're seeing a bunch of red Corvettes, right, all over town.
Mhm.
Like, oh, you brought it to consciousness and you became more aware of that thought because oh, a red Corvette. I think the same thing can happen with feelings like that. Whoop, here's that old feeling. Oh, I remember that old feeling. Remember that old feeling, John? Yeah. And then it just kind of gets reinforced
Mhm.
and it keeps showing up. So every little thing I start to interpret as, well, I'm afraid of that. Oh, fear about that. Oh, shame about that. It keeps getting reinforced because I brought it back to consciousness, right? I brought it to the forefront.
Mhm.
And I have to actively go, wait a minute, hold on here, and have to do something to almost kind of sweep that clean. And it has to be something ceremonial for me, a practice. For me, it might be working out, or it's cooking, or creating something, getting into something that I truly enjoy and love, and can create something quite beautiful. And it reminds me, John, you're fine. You're just fine.
Mhm.
Why are you experiencing shame? And then I can kind of put that thought back on the shelf where it belongs. So that's my kind of example and experience of kind of staying or that shame gets reignited sometimes.
Can we play with this for a minute?
Yeah.
Um, there's a couple of things,
Mm,
because I think it's interesting that we have to keep it in a shelf.
mm,
That's an interesting image,
mm-hmm,
right? It's like I have to hold on to it.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, Shamanically, right?
Mm.
There's a shamanic tradition. What if you cannibalized it? What if you ate it, devoured it, and
Wow.
just made it gone?
Gone.
Um, yeah. So I'm just kind of hearing that part of it. It's like, and I think we do that, right? We hold on to things.
Yeah.
Um, and
And let me just say, because I had a reaction,
oh,
and my reaction was, oh, I can't let that go.
yeah. So what's the marriage with that?
S- All I can say right now is somehow it serves a purpose. And that's all I can say at the moment.
Like what purpose?
I don't know.
Keeps you in check.
It
Keeps you cooking.
Keeps me in check, keeps me cooking, maybe it gives me some leverage in some ways. Um, and so so I want to keep it handy. But I had a reaction
Yeah.
of, ooh, I don't know if I can just chew it up and swallow it and it's gone. I got nervous about that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. So what you're saying is somewhere in the programming, there's an attachment.
Oh yeah.
There's a attachment, if I were using a different word, commitment.
I mean, there's been some pieces of the strings have been snipped, but it's still hanging on.
Yeah. I need to come back to this.
Okay.
Because I had an experience recently that caught me off guard. And I had a very similar question when I talked to Charles about it.
Oh,
so
okay.
You and I, but I want to, another response that I have when old shit comes up, my first go-to question is that my story? It is what's coming up for me some attached, like, is that something my mom told me, my parents, my church, right? Where did that story come from?
What's your origin
story? And so
now?
when it pops up, my first question is, "Ooh, is that mine?"
Mm.
And often I would say in the 80 percentile, often I can say, yeah, that is not mine.
Mm-hmm.
And where I go is I revision where I want to be or with the communication I want to have.
Yeah.
So I think you know this. It's probably the podcast knows because we've been pretty transparent. But 2024. When people say 2024 was shits, I'm like, that wasn't shits for me. It was challenging. I had some challenging moments. Because I turned 40. 20 years ago. And I think at some level, that was my version of a midlife crisis because I always said I was going to live to 120. But I was having like these really weird anxiety attacks. Like, I've never had anxiety. And I would do like the cognitive, like, where's that coming from? What's the story? I'd kind of lean into it a bit. And the anxiety was kind of twofold. One was I'm not doing enough. And what was the other one? Oh, imposter syndrome. Like
imposter syndrome. Yeah.
Really, I'm at this point in my life and I really don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
What I'm more sure about now at 60 than I ever have been is what I don't know.
I know, right? I can relate to that. It seems that's so baffling too. Like, I've been doing this for 25 years. Like, how can I not be, how am I an imposter?
Well, and we were talking about this before the podcast, right? It's like, how do we get people to show up? How do we get them invested, right? Like, it seems like at this point in our lives, we would, right? The abundance that we're seeking, is that our story? Is that the true measurement of success? How many times have we had a little retreat and we'll be a little disappointed when we start out, and at the end of it we'll go, "Oh my God, that was amazing." Right? Right? And we leave, but we go into it thinking, "Oh, we failed," right? But whose story is that?
Whose story is that? Yeah.
Yeah.
And have we created that ourselves, right?
So this anxiety stuff kept going. I finally made an appointment. The therapist that I saw when I came out of the closet in the 1800s is still alive and kicking and active. And she looks fabulous. And yeah, it was really interesting. Here I am, a therapist of 30 years. She was a therapist of 40 years, right? Experience. And so it was really kind of powerful to sit with her, but it was interesting for her to kind of hear me deconstruct this. And she named a few things that very quickly helped me put into perspective what was happening. And it was an old story. And it was kind of a story that I don't know that I was fully conscious of.
Mm-hmm.
Because my comment to Charles was, Charles, I'm 60 years old. I thought I had addressed this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I thought I had reached the finish line. And Charles, who's 90,
Yes, and he was on the podcast a few
yes.
episodes back, so take a look at that interview.
But he just started laughing.
Uh-huh.
And he goes, our relationship with those issues is what's changing.
Yeah.
And I believe turning 60 was a threshold year
Yeah.
for me. And so my relationship with my stories of success, of productivity, of I believe I bring a lot of value. And maybe somebody's going to find these podcasts 30 years after we're dead and go, oh my God, these guys are geniuses. Hopefully the abundance from it flows to the other side. But do you hear, like, it was really powerful for Charles at 90, and Melanoma did this. Charles has done it. My other elders, especially when they're on their deathbeds, it's interesting how many of them said, I'm still doing my work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that is the power and the value of working through these issues, is if they're coming back in the same capacity as they've always been, there's probably more work to be done. I think as we change, our relationship with those issues need to adapt as well.
Yeah.
And so even though I kind of challenged you about putting it on the shelf, I believe subconsciously there are things that will still kind of show up.
And that we know that we've been hanging on to. But like you said, that it's not in the forefront, it's not in the conscious level, but subconscious, even unconscious, right?
Yeah.
It's just not seen. And then it suddenly shows up like, I thought I dealt with that. Or where did that come from?
Well, and I'm thinking, for me personally, like when I started training with Nick, I was like, what, 57? And I didn't realize until I started like losing the weight and getting back in shape and really being able to physically see the differences, that I started to, like, another layer of anxiety started to show up. And as I started to look at it, I thought, oh my God, I'm like, not only am I shedding like this excess body, but it's also revealing the shame that held its container.
Wow.
And the shame that I had about my body. And even though I've gone through, I've done like your workshops and stuff like that, and I know how to present well, but I also know that the language in the back of my head was very shame-based. And, and so part of that work, and Nick was pretty masterful at it, not that he's a therapist or anything, but he was able to at least hold space as a friend and offer encouragement that helped me to kind of recalibrate. I think there's a lot of young guys out there that I've been able to meet who have, like, I hear them differently today than I would have heard them 10 years ago. Because I'm different.
You're different. Yeah. I like that. I love the message that Charles reminded you of, you're changing your relationship with those things. And I think along with that, and changing, because as you're maturing, we're aging, we're growing and continuing to develop, right? Even to our deathbeds, right? We're shifting our thinking around things, our feeling around things, our relationship with things, belief systems, thoughts, our physical appearance, etc. And I would add to that a relanguaging, choosing different words in order to describe yourself, perhaps, or what you do or how you do things. And I think when we get both the external reinforcement of that and we do that internally, we do make those shifts and the relationship does change, it perhaps in a positive way. Just like Nick gave you that positive reinforcement and encouragement, those were little seeds of, you got this, man, look at you, you got this. And then you believe it at some point, like click, light bulb. Oh yeah, I do have this. And, I see that I have done that in the course of my life with certain things, even like with sex and sexuality and the expression of sex, where, as we've talked about, that can be a very shameful kind of thing and topic and guilt and the whole 9 yards, where I've been able to kind of relanguage and see sex as this powerful healing resource that we have, that I have. And it's been both a mindful experience for me, for my internal growth. It gives me confidence. And so I can see my sex and sexuality as something quite different. And that's fairly new, really, at least some of that languaging, as opposed to me in my 20s or 30s or even my 40s, thinking about sex and sexuality. So, yeah, new relationship with that belief system and a relanguaging, especially if you're still hanging on to it. If it's still something you got up on a shelf, okay, and you still have some strings attached to it, well, if it's there, well, get reacquainted with it.
Go to your app, Untold.
Yeah, right. And
That's a good question for it.
Yeah, it would be, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Like, why do I hold? What is my attachment to this belief that I hold up on the shelf?
Yeah. Oh, that would be good. Give you such a good prompt of just.
And what I hate is that damn computer is so smart.
How do you know?
Do you know my mother?
Yeah, no, right. You're making me do work. Yeah, so there are processes where you can come out of that shame. You can come out of that darkness, or I don't even want to say darkness. It may be for some if you're aware of it. For some, this is just the way people live, and it's just the way people live.
Yeah,
without any contemplation around what it is.
Well, I'm wondering about the value, being we're talking to the gay community, if you will, right? I think sometimes in our cultural narratives, right, we sustain and support a lot of these shame-based kinds of ideas. I can think of we have this. I think there's a couple of ways of looking at it. I think, first of all, I'm pausing because I don't want to get in trouble. It's not about shame. Because I think there are things that our community does that reinforces narratives around shame. And I'll give you an example. Our community center awarded a contract for a service to a straight-owned business. Now, okay. But the undertone of that message is, we don't believe there are queer people qualified to provide that service, to even try to get bids to find out if there are other qualified, capable, competent individuals or organizations that can support that. That, in my opinion, right? And we can get into the whole DEI conversation, blah, blah, blah. But when you're trying to build a community center, frankly, you need people from the inside to build the essence of communal self-esteem.
Yeah.
Look at what it's like asking Governor Cox to organize our Pride Day event.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
No, thank you.
Right? Because it's our celebration. Right? I think we talked a little bit about how we promote, the professional societal images of gayness are usually young, white, ripped, gay men.
Yeah.
People of color are still very much excluded. Age diversity is very much excluded. That it's interesting, as I get older and people realize that we're gay, it's almost like, oh, like you're not the image of gay that I'm used to seeing. How we promote a particular atmosphere, right? It's all about the party. It's all about the shirtlessness. It's all about the jock straps. I love those things, but I would argue that we have to celebrate that across the board of
Yes.
diversity of the identities of the people. And I very intentionally said gay is white, young, male, right? Like, I don't see our sisters represented anywhere.
Right. Right.
Trans
Trans.
identities
Right.
are
Exactly.
showing up, but
Mm-hmm.
in very celebrity-wise
Mm-hmm.
ways.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that, like, I think Delta Airlines attempts to but it's not like the older gay couple on the airplane. It's the younger white gay couple
Mm-hmm.
with a biracial baby.
Of course.
But again,
Mm.
I think what happens, we as community members and participants, the boards that we sit on, the social forums that we participate in, have to realize that we're casting a wide net. And we should be insisting upon these public entities of fairly representing us in that diversity. And I think therein's the right. I think the consequence of not seeing that is then we begin to internalize, oh, I'm no longer relevant as an older gay man.
Right.
Where is my place if I'm Latino and queer in this community?
Mm-hmm.
Where is my place if I'm a woman,
Yeah.
a lesbian?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Oh, it spans. There's so many pieces of this.
And let me just default, because
Yeah.
I know this goes everywhere. I'm really focused on the Utah community,
Right.
but I do see like national
Sure.
headlines and publications.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure what maybe New York and California may have a more better reflection of that net that I'm talking about.
Right.
But I'm wondering about communities outside of those two coastlines.
Yeah. 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 Yes. Yes. Depending on where you are, if you're listening to this particular episode, how is it in your in your community? Does it reflect what Jerry was saying about this underlying little story of this gay community is just not quite good enough. We're going to have to kind of take over and do things for them because they're just not quite capable,
Yeah.
right? Is that your community, or is your kind of gay force really standing up and really driving the ship, so to speak? I'd be curious to hear how other communities are doing this, but it really does, for me, it kind of boils down to the individual too, because I think, gosh, some of the people I work with, individually, they're kind of loners, and are looking for connection and just want to be seen and form kind of some community and brotherhood. Uh, and I continue to just invite those folks to my yoga classes and meditation and whatnot, because what they get to see is that they do fit in, and that because one of the questions I get, like, for especially with yoga, I get, oh, I'm kind of nervous, I'm not flexible, and I bet everyone is fit and flexible. And I said, well, that's actually not quite the whole truth. Come show up, and you're going to see people and meet people who are just like you, as far as maybe body size, age, level of flexibility, level of yoga. You're gonna feel accepted, and you're gonna fit in, because you won't feel like you won't feel out of the box.
This is a weird example, but how did Richard Simmons do it? Richard Simmons was a fitness guru in the 80s and 90s, right? Get fit to the oldies.
Yeah.
But I mean, he kind of made it incredibly marketable to have incredibly diverse participants
Mm-hmm.
in his exercise classes. I mean, and he achieved celebrityship. And I'm just kind of mad, like, how did he do that? How did he? Were they actors? No.
Well, from just what I know, I guess, his charisma, his personality, even I think maybe just some of his own background and everything, he could relate. I think he can relate to these people who showed up in his classes
Yeah.
and can see eye to eye with folks. And so, come on, we're going to do this together. He was in it with them and cheered them on, right?
So going back to my point,
Mm-hmm.
if I have a community center, I need to know that the people at that center get me.
Yeah.
They understand me, that they're providing, right? Yeah. Maybe that's even something for us to think about with
True.
Mindfully Gay. It's like,
True. Yeah.
how do we create the energetic space? Because I think the reason people don't show up for stuff, or the challenges that we have about people showing up, is I think the inner dialogue disqualifies people. Because how many people love the idea, love the podcast, right? And what I frequently hear from people is it's very anxious provoking to show up.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if the key then is creating or communicating that relatability.
That eye-to-eye-ness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I think we're pretty transparent here. I mean, I just talked about anxiety attacks.
I hope so. And I think that's, what we've kind of set out to do, or this is what the podcast has evolved into. Just, we're not the experts. We're just kind of shooting the shit about some things. And here's what we know and believe and have thought about in our little bubble, right? And just sharing it with folks. And hopefully it's inspiring folks to kind of do the same. Maybe, I don't know. Are we intimidating?
Maybe normalizing the struggle.
Normalizing the struggle. Yeah.
Because
we've been there.
Well, and I think it's easy to cast a story, right? All of us, Nick included, right? We all come with our particular reputations and how people see us. And often what people see is a projection because they don't know the inner workings of how we got to where we are or how we see it within ourselves. And again, one of the cultural norms is, right, cautiousness about oversharing, cautiousness about being too transparent.
Yeah, too transparent, too vulnerable. That is a little scary.
But what I'm hearing is this, in building community, right? If we looked at each other as all kind of sharing similar challenges and struggles, sharing desired states of success and happiness, right? I wonder how that would change our communication on social platforms.
You can't show them if you ask again from your iPhone.
Yep, Siri just wanted to chime into the conversation if you heard that.
I told you I was hearing voices. Well, I think there's a lot that we've said that can be digested and worked on. I think it's I think what would make this conversation lively, I'm just listening to Dan Savage's Love, and people call in and they leave comments. And I wonder if there's a way we can create like a voice mailbox where people can, hey, I was listening to your podcast on this episode and here are my thoughts.
Yeah, that could be done. It really can.
Okay, John's going to set that up.
Yeah, I can do that.
Because the value of the podcast is he'll play someone's question or their thought, and then he'll respond to them. It's a little dialogue about it.
Yeah. In the meantime, we'll work on that. But in the meantime, leave us a comment on all those platforms. You can, whether you could be on the Facebook group or Instagram, right? We have our website, mindfullygay.com. You can even, I think you can send emails through that way too. But certainly see some of our events that are scheduled. We have an upcoming retreat this year.
April.
In April, that's right, April 2025. So look forward to that. And leave a review, leave a comment. We want to hear from you because it really is, what you give us inspiration, really. You give us inspiration and motivation to, what we sometimes talk about on the show. And if you've got some issues or questions or thoughts about something that you need some clarity or just some insight, we'll just kind of hash it out and play with it here. Or you can even come on the podcast. We're very open to having guests on the show. Whether you call in, we'll get that set up, or you get on Zoom and have a conversation with us and be on the podcast. So lots of ways to kind of, get your voice, have your voice heard.
Amen. Well, till next week.
All righty. We'll see you next time on the next episode of the Mindfully Gay podcast. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Mindfully Gay podcast. If you enjoyed our conversation today, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. This way you won't miss out on any of our upcoming episodes, where we continue to explore fascinating topics and share meaningful stories. Your support means the world to us. See you in the next episode.